So we've talked about what economists think they can bring to the study of history, but equally important is what history can bring to the study of economics. And this is really where economic historians kind of situate themselves. As I mentioned before, we are economists first and foremost, right? So our use of history is really meant to guide the thinking of economists and to shape the way that economics as a field evolves. So what do we think as economic historians history can do for our study of economics, for our understanding of economics? There's really a broad range of things. So we can think of different historical events as tests of our hypotheses. So if we have an economic model, what does that model predict will happen when we have the Great Recession, when we have the Great Depression, or when we have a border open up or a border close? So actually having the historical evidence to tell us what happened before and after those events gives us a way to see, was our model's predictions correct? So historical events and data also provide this source of compelling stylized facts, right? So this is going to motivate new economic theory. So observing something in history that doesn't quite make sense to us or provides sort of a surprising result now gives us the motivation of saying, how can we construct some economic modeling that explains that surprising fact? So there's also a wealth of comparative analysis possibilities opened up if we broaden the time span and the places that we consider in our economics research. So we'll get back to this more in a second, but a lot of what economists use to test their theories, to sort of develop their theories, is going to be, say, variation across states in the United States in certain Medicare policies over the 1990s and early 2000s. Right? So that's the kind of variation we use. This state had more generous benefits than this state. How does that change consumer behavior? That's an incredibly narrow slice of the world, right? The people from those two states are living in very much the same time period. They're living under the very same laws and institutions very broadly, right? Maybe they would have behaved very differently had they been in a different country, a different time period, under different overall economic conditions. Right? And so the broader our scope, the broader our net for the events and people we think about, the more full our understanding of economics is going to be. So history also gives us additional context for decision making. So when people don't seem to behave rationally, in the words of an economist, or when it seems hard to understand the actions of a particular state or a particular person, right? Oftentimes history gives us the context, gives us the clues to say, hey, our narrow, parsimonious model didn't include some of the key things that were going on at the time, right? Or didn't understand the role that religion had in that particular state at that particular point in history, right? These things are really important to properly understand why people are making the decisions they make, and modeling those decisions is at the core of economics. So the other thing we need to bring in from history to really get economics right is understanding that history matters. That there's a long persistence where things that happened decades ago, even centuries ago, can still have impacts today on how economies operate, how people respond, how people behave. Right? So if we try to just look at the current state of the world and don't understand those long-run historical influences, we're not really going to be able to explain things properly. So that leads to the last giant thing that history is going to bring to economics, and that's this notion of institutions. So when an economist talks about institutions, we're talking about the rules of the game, right? The rules under which people make these decisions, the rules under which markets operate. So think of basic laws and contracts, right? Those sorts of things, but also think about social norms and customs, right? These are all things that change the way we behave in terms of our economic interactions. And so understanding those institutions, which often require understanding the history of a country and of people, right, becomes essential to explaining how economies are going to function. So let's walk through a couple of examples of what I'm talking about here. So first, let's think about history providing different contexts, right, and these stylized facts that are going to motivate new thinking about how economies actually function. So this is a pretty famous graph among economic historians, sometimes called the hockey stick graph. This particular version of it comes from Greg Clark's book, A Farewell to Alms. And what it's showing is sort of a very sketchy estimate of income per person going back 3,000 years, right? So What we've got is, if we just looked at modern economies, we see steady economic growth. We see steady gains in income per person, excepting the occasional recession or war or something like that. But our modern world is a world in which economies grow, right? And they also grow relative to the size of the population, so that average incomes are rising. If you only looked at the last half century of economic growth in developed countries, you would say that that's what we have to explain, right? My fundamental kind of modeling of how economies function has to match this notion that they're going to steadily grow, right? And that income per person is going to go up. That, however, is not at all how the vast majority of history is unfolded. So what we see, if we look historically, is that growth in income per person, that's something that's only really happened over the last 200 years. If we look at the thousands of years before that, you have ups and downs, and these are fairly substantial ups and downs, but no steady progress. So it's a thing we call the Malthusian trap, but basically we had thousands of years of no sustained gains in the standard of living. And this notion that each generation is going to live better than the last, that's really a very, very modern notion. Okay? But our economic theory should still be able to understand that Malthusian trap era. And so what's happened by acknowledging that is we've gotten much deeper theories of how growth works in economies, right? By having to think about what can reconcile these two very different states of the world. Okay? So we can also think about, even if we're in roughly a similar state of the world in terms of how economies work and functions, right? We'd still like to observe people at very different parts of distributions, because the way they respond to things might differ depending on what margin they're on, okay? So we usually think in terms of small changes as economists. We think about a small change in a tax rate, a small change in a tariff rate, right? But if we want to think about how a big change is going to work, well, people might respond to that big change very differently than that small change, right? And so what we'd like is some historical evidence where we're at those totally different values. So as a quick example that's kind of particularly relevant to international relations, particularly relevant to international relations this past year, think about the trade war with China that we've been engaged in with these tariff rates, right? So the tariff rates that we're seeing in this trade war are incredibly high relative to the tariffs that we've seen over the past few decades. So this is a graph of just average US tariff rates from the 1820s up to 2016s, right? So if we use our modern economic data, which usually goes back to the 1970s, maybe the 1960s, we're looking at single-digit tariff rates here on average. If you're thinking about some of these tariffs that have been imposed over the last year, right, well, they're shooting up much, much higher, right? All our modern data can only tell us how people respond to tiny changes around single-digit tariff rates. But if we want to know how they're going to respond to these really massive tariff rates, that modern data is sort of useless to us. However, we can go back to these historical periods where we did much more of our funding of the federal government through tariffs, right? And we're also much more protectionist, and because of that, had very high tariffs. Well, seeing how firms and consumers respond when tariff rates are at those much higher levels might be the far more relevant thing for us to know the impacts of these current tariffs than seeing how people responded to small changes back in the 90s and 80s, right? So just to keep things a little bit even darker about our modern times here, right? Think about why I'm talking to you online right now, because we're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So how is this going to affect our economy? Well, we can look at other sort of epidemics that have happened in the last couple of decades, but none of them shut down our national economy in the way that we're seeing the coronavirus do right now, right? But if we go back to 1918, when we had the Spanish flu, that influenza pandemic was similarly sort of massive on scale in terms of bringing our economies to a halt, bringing international trade and travel to a halt. So what you're looking at here are hospital beds set up in the gymnasium at Iowa State University back in 1918, right? And you've got this modern day equivalent sort of eerily similar in Yale's gymnasium just this past week, right? So if we want to think about how this is going to impact our economy, how this is going to impact international relations, right? The closest thing we have to study is going back in history to look at something like that influenza pandemic, okay? All right, so there's also some other ways we can get some neat heterogeneity, right? So by looking at different societies, you can have sort of very different decision-making taking place because people, in a lot of ways, behaved very differently at different points in time and different places. So here's some more data from Greg Clark's book, Farewell to Alms. So in this particular table, he was looking at different societies and their interest rates. Now, in this period, right, there's really no inflation because you're not dealing with paper currency being printed by states, okay? So if you think about what that interest rate really is, this is a real interest rate. It's not nominal, it's not capturing inflation. So what I mean by that is this is really kind of telling us about how patient people are with saving their money, how hard it is to get them to give up their money for a certain period of time to get it back plus some interest, right? So the higher the interest rate, we can think about that as the less patient people in that society are. Okay? So when you look at this, what you see is that these interest rates have fallen dramatically from these very early civilizations in Babylonia and Greece and Rome, right, to modern day civilizations. This table getting us up into sort of the eve of the Industrial Revolution. So the reason Clark uses this table is because a bunch of economic historians have worked on the notion that patience and saving and planning ahead might have been integral parts of what allowed us to industrialize, right? But you can learn more about that on your own. What I want to point out is that this notion of how patient you are is a very fundamental thing to individual decision making, right? To individual investing in your own education, in your own businesses, in your children, and all of that. And so having these massive differences across societies, right, give us a fascinating sort of set of data to work with to think about things like how parents invest in their kids. Right? We can see very different settings if we have these societies with very different preferences over saving and patience. So one of the biggest things that history is going to give us in terms of a better understanding of economics and a better sort of way for us to predict how things are going to unfold in the future is by helping us understand path dependence, helping us understand that history matters. History is still informing the way people act today. So this is a notion that was really popularized among economic historians by Paul David, who did a lot of work on technological change over time. So from one of his big addresses at a conference, here's a great quote about path dependence. So Cicero demands of the historians first that we tell true stories. I intend fully to perform my duty on this occasion by giving you a homely piece of narrative economic history in which one damn thing follows another. The main point of the story will become plain enough. It is sometimes not possible to uncover the logic or illogic of the world around us, except by understanding how it got that way. So what's the story David's going to tell? Well, what he's going to talk about is actually the keyboard. Let me find one right here. So he's going to talk about why we use the QWERTY keyboard. Right? So it's the QWERTY keyboard because we go QWERTY across the top. And David's point is that if we don't think about history, we're going to look at the layout of that keyboard and we're going to rack our brains and we're going to get frustrated trying to figure out why was that the efficient keyboard layout we decided to come up with. Okay? And if we can't come up with a good reason, then all of a sudden we have sort of a crisis within the economics profession where maybe markets aren't providing efficient outcomes and blah, 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 and all of that, right? So we need to understand this, and David's point is we can only understand why it's QWERTY by looking to history. And so his point is that when we still use typewriters, and these typewriters would have different levers for each letter, so they'd come up to strike the ribbon and print things on paper, right? It was a problem if they were banging into each other, right? So you didn't want to use two keys that are used very close together. So say S and I. Very common letters when you're typing words. If they were close together in terms of where the keys were and then where the levers were, you had a much higher chance they'd get in each other's way. And so you wanted to spread out the commonly used keys, and that's why that was an efficient keyboard layout, right? That reason is no longer relevant, right? So there are no levers on the back of this keyboard at all, right? Probably didn't need to show you that to prove it. But David's point is we still do that because once it was efficient, everybody learned to use that key layout. And so even though there might be better layouts in terms of things that could help us type faster, if that's what we learned on, right, we're kind of locked into this particular technology, right? So if you're going to go to the computer lab, it's going to be a problem if every computer suddenly has a different key layout on there. Okay? So there's historical reasons that we had the keyboard laid out that way. And then because of path dependency, it stays that way. So if we want to explain why it looks the way it does, we have to turn to history. So for another cool example of this path dependence, let's take a quick field trip down to the James River. All right, so here we go. Welcome to the James River. So we're out here because this wide, glorious swath of the James River down here at Jamestown Beach is going to be part of the explanation for why the Williamsburg economy functions fundamentally differently from the Richmond economy today. It's basically a story about shipping, transportation, railroads, and path dependency. So let's head back and see what I'm talking about. All right, hopefully that video worked. If not, this is going to seem very awkward, but let's talk about what we were talking about at the beach there, right? So the James could have these big ships on there, transporting tobacco, transporting agricultural goods up and down the James River, kind of docking at each of these plantations along the way. And then when they got to Richmond, right, it gets rocky at Richmond. We have those rapids. And so you had to switch into these small boats, into these bateaus. Okay? So we have to take all the goods out of the big ship, put them all on this little ship, right? And then we can go further up the James, okay, into kind of Western Virginia. Because of all that unloading and loading, right, you get a trading post. Everybody that's on these ships is going to buy some stuff. It's going to eat some food. It's going to need some supplies. And so this geographic feature of the river that's really relevant when we're transporting things becomes important for kind of creating this locus of economic activity, right? So what Blakely and Lind show in this cool paper from the Quarterly Journal of Economics is that those rocky rapids in Richmond are the result of this geographic feature called the fall line, right? It's a change in the geology that leads to those rapids. And that fall line actually extends up and down the East Coast here. And what they show is that cities were likely to form on that fall line because that same shifting of goods had to happen at each one of those locations when a river crossed the fall line. So where we see rivers cross the fall line, right, that's where we see cities. So we see Richmond, right here, when the James crosses the fall line. We can go to my hometown of Philadelphia, which happens to be where the Schuylkill River crosses the fall line, right? So what's fascinating about this is not so much just the story of why the cities end up where they did, right? It's about the path dependence here, okay? Because if we go to Richmond today and look at those rapids right here, right, you're not going to see people loading and unloading boats. What you're going to see are trains going back and forth with lots of goods who don't have to stop at all. So this geographic advantage of being located where it was is no longer an advantage for Richmond. Okay? And so what Blakely and Lind are going to do is say this gives us this great natural experiment where we know why geography determined where cities were back in the 1700s, right? That advantage gets shut down in the 1800s. And then when we look 150 years later, right, does that advantage still matter? And what they find is that it still does. That the cities that had that geographic advantage in the 1700s, even though it plays no direct role anymore for the past 150 years, they're still bigger, denser, more economically productive cities today. All right? And so they think of this as a story of agglomeration economies, where once you build up a certain density, you get more ideas generated because we're all bouncing ideas off each other, right? You get more complementarities between different businesses, and then you get even more productive as a result, okay? You don't need to worry about that. Just need to realize that you can't understand why Richmond or Philadelphia are the way they are today without understanding that path dependence on this historical event. All right, so the final and sort of massive thing that history is going to add to the study of economics is this notion of institutions. The rules of the game matter, and the different societies have had very different rules over time. And I mentioned at the very start, when I talked about Bob Fogel, that he shared that Nobel Prize with another economic historian. And that other economic historian is this guy, Doug North. So Doug North really pioneered this notion of modeling institutions to understand economies. So basically saying that if we don't understand how the rules are shaping people's actions, right, we're not going to understand why one society and economy differ substantially from another, or why one policy in one economy doesn't have the same effects in another. To see how important this can be, let's quickly look at this figure from Nathan Nunn's work on slavery in Africa. So one thing that's sort of been a puzzle to economists for decades is the slow average economic growth of African countries relative to other areas. So when you graph GDP per capita over time, in the latter half of the 20th century for African countries, people typically saw something like this sort of light gray line here that didn't look like particularly impressive economic growth. All right? So what Nunn looks at is he says, well, this actually might not be the result of people sort of making the wrong decisions today or some kind of fundamental issue with African climate or culture or anything like that, right? He's going to say, actually, this has its roots in historical institutions, okay, and history itself. So when he splits up countries by countries that were heavily involved in the slave trade and countries that weren't heavily involved in the slave trade, right, this is what he finds. Those countries that were heavily involved are those countries that have that very slow economic growth today. If you look at the African countries that weren't heavily involved in the slave trade, they have very robust economic growth over that past half century. Economic growth that looks like any other region. So you're not trying to explain why is the African economy sort of underdeveloped, what's wrong with Africa or something like that, right? Because those countries that weren't involved in the slave trade are doing just as well as other areas. So what it is you have to understand how did the slave trade hundreds of years ago have these long-lasting impacts on economies today. And Nunn's explanation is really going to come down to things like ethnic fractionalization and how it slows down the formation of modern states and how it creates different levels of mistrust. Really fascinating work that he's done there. But his point is that if you don't understand this history from hundreds of years ago, you're not going to understand the economic development today, nor are you going to understand what you should do policy-wise to improve economic outcomes today or to improve relations between countries today, right? So as economists, we have so much to learn from history, right? And part of the role of the economic historian is to make certain that we take these lessons from history. All right, that's all I've got for you.